Hi everyone, my name is Ashish Jain. I do product management for VMware. I'm not as funny as Brian, so I'm not going to have funny, awkward pictures in my session. I'm not as geeky as Brian either, so I won't have a half cut off, unreadable, unencrypted token either in my presentation. So having said that, I have been in the industry for 10 plus years. I'm fairly heavily involved with the NAPPS working group for mobile SSO. So I'm hoping to use this time to give you an overview of the spec, the workflow, the use cases, where we are as an industry today, and why I think it matters to all of us. So before I get into the flows, I wanted to just kind of start with some very quick stats. So in 2009, the number of mobile devices, which included the smartphones and the tablets, were about 150 million. At the same time, the number of PCs which were shipped were about 300 million. You fast forward that to 2012, the number of PCs were about 320 million, and the number of mobile devices were about 850 million. So that kind of gives you an idea in terms of the pace of how one component or one type of devices are outpacing the other type of devices. And if you kind of fast forward it, like I said, from 2017, which is 3 years from now, the number of PCs shipped would be in the range of about 350 million. That included desktops and laptops. The number of smart devices, which include the smartphones and tablets, would be about 1.8 billion. So think about it for a second, which is for every PC that's entering the workplace, there would be 5 smartphones entering the workplace. So when you talk about, when you go back to your work and you want to focus into what's coming up, where you need to spend your time, kind of keep that picture in mind. One more chart, and I promise this is the last one, but if you see at the bottom, the green and the yellow, which is the PCs, you can see the share shrinking, and then you can see the smartphones and the devices kind of increasing. So again, 3 years from now, which if you think about it is not very far off, you're going to have 83% of the devices would be one of those. So take a pause for a second. Like I said, the environment that we all operate in today, 3 years from now, 87% of those devices will be smartphones. So everything that we do in terms of application, single sign-on, identity management, policy management, just imagine the impact it's going to have when the devices that you bring to your workplace would be 83% mobile devices. So with that background, and before I go into the mobile flows, I wanted to kind of spend the next 10 minutes or so to kind of walk you through how this industry has evolved for the past 10 years. Because the way I see a pattern of how we solved the web SSO situations 10, 15 years ago is exactly the same way how we are progressing to solve the mobile application management. So, rewind back to 10, 15 years, and most likely many of you have lived that journey with me. If you're an application developer, you have to write an application. The first thing that you need is allow the users to have access to your system. So you kind of create your own user store, right? So everybody started creating their own username and a password, database systems, and so forth. So over a period of time, as you can imagine, more and more applications, more and more user stores start to kind of happen in the system. Then, one smart developer came along and he said, I'm not going to write my own user store. I'm going to piggyback on something that I already have. So that's when you see multiple applications kind of combining together, trying to leverage a same user store. At the same time, it is still kind of decoupled from what the system of identity management is in the enterprise. The next step kind of came along when you have Active Directory and people realized, I already have AD, that's the source of truth. Instead of trying to create why don't I bind runtime with an AD? So many of the applications then kind of started to just use the AD for the source of truth and the authentication. So that's the time when many of the policy management servers, if you guys remember the SiteMinder or Oblix or the RSA Clear Trust, and they all kind of came up with this idea of a central independent system which connects to AD. At the same time, they have these web agents which will get deployed for each of those web applications. So their idea was that when I connect to AD directly, I don't have single sign-on, I don't have session, I don't have additional attributes that I need to make policy decisions, and hence this kind of a separate breed of products kind of started to happen. So keep this picture in mind because we're going to come back to it, because I believe that today where we are in terms of the mobile application development and how we are managing that is very similar to this picture. However, if you just replace the agents with an SDK, that's, I think, where we stand today. So this model worked fairly well when you are working for applications that are within your enterprise. So if you have a reason to talk to only web applications which were managed, developed, maintained, run by your own IT, you're able to have a fairly decent single sign-on system. The challenge begins when I have a reason to do a B2B federation, or I have a reason to cross-domain for any of these systems. So they started by having those SDKs or agents that can be deployed cross-domain. But over a period of time, people realized that it's just kind of hard. And then eventually, this idea of a standard way to represent a token, a standard profile, and kind of SAML came along. So I know some of the people in this room have been heavily involved with trying to take each proprietary token format from the SiteMinder and Oblix and ClearTrust and a few others and coming up with a schema. So as an enterprise, when you say, if I'm going to use SAML to talk to a component which is running into a different enterprise, why wouldn't I use the same SAML to talk to an application which is running into my own enterprise? So that's when you saw many of the policy management and the proprietary token formats, even for within the enterprise, being kind of replaced by SAML. At the same time frame, you see many of the SaaS applications, the Salesforce and the WebEx kind of started to happen, and they were more closer to the cross-domain federation model than they were within the enterprise. So it kind of makes sense for them to just adopt the SAML model. So if you look at the industry today, I think 5 or 8 years ago, if you think about it, there was nobody in the SaaS world who was supporting SAML. Today, there are about 150 or so SaaS providers which support SAML. The next step kind of came in when they started application is there was a reason to make the same access through an API. So that happened because either you have the iOS applications or the native application, which were the main driver. But even otherwise, when you want to have multiple applications, multiple web applications kind of talk to each other. So that's the time when, if you have a reason to native app to talk to a SaaS provider, kind of the OAuth kind of came into the picture. Once we have an OAuth infrastructure from a SaaS provider over a period of time, enterprise also kind of start to write their own application which had access through an API. So it made sense for them to kind of increase the stack to build an OAuth AS server within the enterprise. So if I take a step back and then say where we are as an industry today, I think this is the picture which kind of represents that. Many of the enterprise that we talk to, many of the customers that we talk to, they have a fairly decent SAML implementation in-house. Majority of the SaaS providers that are available today have a fairly decent SAML RP implementation in place. And most of the SaaS providers, when they have to implement a native application for Android, iOS, or for other API access, most of them end up going into the OAuth route. And any IT enterprise which is kind of going through this cloud and mobile movement, they are kind of focusing more and more towards the API economy, and OAuth happens to be the choice of protocol to protect those access points. 2 years ago, I guess at CIS, when SAML was shot dead, I was expecting some laughs here, but I guess you were not here. Exactly, yeah. So SAML was shot dead, but even otherwise, I think you saw in Brian's diagram earlier today, which is there is the 90% of the screen was taken by a SAML token, and then you have in 2 lines of the JOT token. The OpenID kind of came in, and the idea was you have a single stack. It's built on top of OAuth. It has a much cleaner, much lighter weight implementation in terms of a token format. When we talk to customers today, I think we don't yet see a lot of OpenID Connect implementations. This was my point in the previous slide. This is where I think we are today. Having said that, I see no reason that 2 years from now, most of the implementations in the SaaS world or even for B2B federation would not be based on top of OpenID Connect. The next step, if you think about it, the next step when you have a single stack, you have a single way to represent a token in the JOT format. You have a JW stake implementation in your enterprise. The next step is that how do I solve the same problem for mobile applications? And hence this concept, which we're going to talk about today, is kind of a token agent. So you can think of token agent as kind of the IDP proxy model, which is there is something on my device which runs next to my application, and it kind of does all the hard work instead of each application having to connect to either a SAML IDP or to connect to an OAuth AS. So coming back to how this TA plays a role, I'm fairly sure that most of you have seen this flow like a million times in your career, but the most standard way how you access a web application today would be you come into a relying party. This could be your internal web application, this could be your Salesforce. You get redirected to an IDP, you authenticate using an Active Directory, you get back a SAML response, and then you have access. If you convert that of how all of them are going into the mobile application flow, the standard approach is today, like as of today, you're going to go access a mobile application on your device on a Springboard. It is going to have a web view where it's going to go to the OAuth AS, which is going to redirect you to an IDP. You're going to authenticate using any credentials that you have. So in this case, I'm representing AD, but for all that matters, it could be any kind of multi-factor auth that you have deployed. Once that is done, I should build it up. Once that is done, the IDP will give you a SAML response. The OAuth AS will issue you a SAML token. The mobile application now has a SAML token, an OAuth access token, which is it's going to take to go and then connect or make the API call to the resource server. So my understanding, and if this is different than what you guys think, that as of today, every SaaS application, when you look into Box and WebEx and Salesforce, follows this flow, which was complicated when I have one app. It gets super complicated when I have 10 apps. Because now for each of those 10 applications, when I open the IDP into a web view, which is not able to share a session, I have to go through that flow over and over and over. So if entering a password on a desktop browser with a proper keyboard was challenging, think about doing that on a mobile phone, and especially when some companies have the restrictions to go for a multi-factor auth. So you can imagine typing your secure ID over and over and over. So kind of walk you through in terms of the flows, the way it works today. You are on the device, you see a bunch of applications that your enterprise has given you, the Box and the Salesforce and Concur and the ADP of the world. You pick an application, you click on it, and I kind of skip through the IDP discovery process because many of these applications, when they come on the device, they actually don't know which domain server to connect to, which is your IDP and so forth. So there is a discovery process which happens, but once that is done, you enter your identifier, it takes you to your IDP, which essentially is your SAML IDP, you authenticate, and then you have access to the application. You want to access some other application, you kind of go through the same flow, you do an IDP discovery, you enter your email address, it takes you to your IDP screen, you log in again, no sharing of sessions, and in our case, we do have to enter secure ID. So I have a personal reason to move this spec as soon as I can. And then you go to WebEx, and now you have access to web application, to a WebEx system. So this flow is essentially what we see all the time. And the issues with this approach is first, I have to do authentication every time. The second issue is that there is no invalidation of the access token. So I know we talked about SCIM in the previous session, and it's progressing fairly well. But if I look into today, how much of that is implemented, there is not much. So today, if the flow is, once all this is done, and then the person leaves the company or he's deprovisions from the AD, the web SSO flow is normally handled because we go and check with the AD at runtime. However, for the native app flow, most of the time, all the mobile applications, they end up keeping a long-lived access token on the device. So even if I have deprovisioned the user from the AD, I don't really have a guarantee as an IT admin that that access token has been invalidated, because in many cases it depends on the SaaS provider. The third case, which doesn't really get handled by this community or this group, is even if I did invalidate the Active Directory, even if I did disable the account in AD and in my resource server, even if I did invalidate the API access token, I still haven't cleaned up the offline cache. So many of these providers, Box of the world, they still keep some offline cached data on the device. So even if I have done all of that, there is still corporate enterprise data sitting on my device, which is completely, not completely, but it is hackable. So that use case doesn't technically get handled by this group of people. This is where the MDM vendors, the mobile device management vendors, comes into place to manage the device and wipe the application and data. Having said that, when we talk broadly of the challenges for mobile application, SSO and management and identity, it does make sense to kind of reference it. So if I take a step back, we walked through how it works today. And if I take a step back and forget how the protocols have evolved or where we are today, this is the experience what I want as an end user, right? And I expect the community, this community, to kind of make it happen. So I said the experience that I want is, I'm going to borrow some terms from the SAML terminology, but the idea of an SP init, I come to my Springboard, I see a bunch of applications, so I can either use this model or I'll go to an IDP init model where essentially I have an application launcher. And what that means is that I log in, I tell to the device once who I am, and then I see a bunch of applications that I am supposed to have access to. And as an end user, I don't really care, honestly, if this is a web application or a mobile application. For me, entering a password or a secure ID or any multi-factor auth is a pain. And I've told you once, and in the next 10 minutes, I haven't changed, so let's not make me enter again. So the experience which I want as an end user is, I kind of come in either from the SP init flow through a Springboard or from an IDP init flow, which is from, I use the word launcher to describe this, and I click on Box, and I have access to Box. I click on WebEx, and I have access to WebEx. So, kind of make it happen behind the scene, and given the work which we have done from the SAML evolution for the past 10 years, the OAuth to make the API access, the OpenID Connect to have the representation of an ID token on top of OAuth, and the profile work that we are doing into NAPPS, we believe that it's actually not very far off to give that implementation into, I think Kelly mentioned that what we want to do is it's simple, it's secure, and it's standard based. So I'm going to use the same kind of a terminology that if you do it in the same simple, secure, standard way, it has a much wider chance of adoption than what we could do if we all implement our own solutions. So where we are today, having said that, this is kind of the context. Where we are today, in generally, there is acknowledgement that the flow that we talked through is how it works today. There's acknowledgement that it's a pain, and there are ways to address it or solve it today. So there are a bunch of APIs and SDKs which many of the vendors have kind of put together. I only listed 4 or 5 of them, but there's a few more. So layer 7 has something similar. They have a mobile SDK which you embed into your application developer code base. It kind of works. Centrify has an SDK. Samsung Knox, the platform on top of the Android which Samsung built, has a built-in SSO and auth layer. Google has something very similar, which they allow the Android developer to piggyback on the Google Account Manager, pick the identity, and have the same access token. So when I said, take this picture, I believe that where we are today from the proprietary SDK for mobile SSO, it's kind of worked very similar to this model of policy management that we had, I would say, late 90s. When we talk about the deployment models, there are kind of 3 types of deployment models that we see for native applications. The first one is, I'm an enterprise and I have a bunch of applications I'm writing in-house. So I put them into the enterprise in-house development bucket. The reason why it's different is because most of the time in these scenarios, you have a single OAuth AS, which is deployed within the enterprise that's within your control. At the same time, for most of these applications, you have a single signing key that you use to write the applications. So you can take some leverage which you otherwise would not be able to take if the application developer is outside of your own company. So to be honest, the models described or the SDKs described in the previous slide, they kind of work fairly decently for the enterprise in-house apps because they kind of make some shortcuts. For instance, one of the SDK uses the Apple keychain to store the shared token format or the shared keys. You can only do that if the app signing key for all the apps is similar. The other challenge is that if you take an SDK and if you give it to a SaaS provider, then SaaS provider has to take an SDK from each vendor. So if you're Box and you go to iTunes, you now have a box for Ping, you have a box for Okta, you have a box for Mobile Iron, you have a box for AirWatch, and you have a box for Good, and so forth. So eventually it kind of becomes a pain for a SaaS provider to be able to have multiple SDKs just to talk to the exact same kind of a flows across different vendors. The third use case, so the second deployment model is, you are Box and you have one native app. The third deployment model, which is kind of in between, which is you're a single SaaS provider and you have multiple native apps. So an example of that would be Salesforce. Every time I go to iTunes, there is one more Salesforce app. So there is a bunch of Salesforce application and they all kind of share kind of similar infrastructure. Office 365 is the other example, which is there is more than one native app that you will have on the device. But behind the scene, they are kind of connected to a single OAuth AS, which is run and managed by Microsoft, which is run and managed by Salesforce. Okay, so this was the context. Coming back to where we come into play. So NAPPS is a working group. I think it stands for Native Applications. And to be honest, it takes more time to come with the naming of the working group than it takes to work on the specs. And I'm not kidding, right? So it takes a while, but we finally have a working group. It's part of the OpenID Foundation. It's a profile of OpenID Connect, and we have several participants for the past year or so, which have been contributing, including VMware, AirWatch, Mobile Iron, Ping, Okta, and OneLogin. So if you see the list of people who are contributing, it's a fairly good mix of the identity community, which is kind of fairly well represented here, and a good representation of the mobile community, which kind of brings some different kind of cases and scenarios. But I think in between those two communities, it's a fairly good chance that we are able to give the experience that we talked before. So just at a high level, the terminology of NAPPS, we introduced a concept called as a token agent. And token agent, think of this is a native app which sits right next to the other native applications that you have. And the primary role of this is kind of like an IDP proxy to get the tokens on behalf of the other native applications that you want to get to. The second term is the app info endpoint. It kind of gets driven by the user info endpoint in the OpenID Connect specs. And the idea is for TA to make an API call and get more information about the apps. So the TA, for instance, would like to know which apps am I supposed to hand over token to. The TA may like to know the names and the icons and other information about the app so that he can put together and paint that launcher I showed earlier. The third is the primary token, and before the TA can do anything on behalf of the other application, it needs to have its own OAuth access token. It needs to authorize itself that, yes, I'm allowed to get access tokens on behalf of the other. So we kind of split into two types of tokens. We have a primary token, which is the token that authorizes the token agent. And then we have secondary tokens, which the token agent uses to go get access tokens for other native apps. It will get more clear in the next diagram for a flow. Any questions so far? I know I'm probably going too fast. Okay. So this is how the flow works today, right? If you are a user, you're going to go to mobile application, exactly how you go today. When you click on it, the mobile application in the previous diagram, it will go talk to the OAuth AS to get a token, and then the whole IDP redirection flow happens. In this case, the mobile application comes to a token agent, and it says to a token agent, give me a token for me to log in. If this is the very first time the mobile application is accessing, the token agent is going to go to the OAuth AS, and it's going to say, I would like to get a primary token. The OAuth AS is going to say, I don't know who you are, so I'm going to have to redirect you, authenticate you through an IDP. So all the work that we have done in the past in between the different protocols, we kind of leverage all of that. So you authenticate using an IDP, you get back, and the OAuth access token now give back, the OAuth authorization server now give back a primary token to the token agent. The token agent now uses that primary token and then go back to the AS and then say, I would like to have a secondary token to give to the mobile application. Once you get the secondary token, you take that secondary token, give it to the mobile application. Mobile app then uses that secondary token to go to its own RP and own RS to be able to have access and make the API calls. So there are a few subtle details which I'm skipping over. For instance, if the token agent has the ability to go and talk to the AS even without the mobile app invoking it. So, one flow that I kind of walk you through is I come in, completely new iPad, I click on the mobile application and kind of walk you through it. The token agent is something that you may have installed prior, either through your IDP or through your MDM solution, and the token agent can make the 3, 5, and 4, and all the 6 and 7 for all the applications. So token agent, prior to any of this happening, can go in, figure out the secondary tokens for all the apps that you're entitled to, keep them into a state within the token agent. So when, as an end user, I click on a mobile application, I click on 2, all the stuff behind the scene has already happened, I get back an 8. So the experience for the end user, like I said, the first time around, it's slightly different. You have to authenticate at least once, and there are ways we think we can even optimize that experience. But in generally, the flow for application developer or application user would be come in, click on it, I go through 2, I go through 8, and I have access. This is kind of the same flow, just depicting a little bit more from a sequence perspective, just kind of following only the NAPPS part, which is, as a device, I come in, the first step I do is I do login and authorize, I get back a primary token, I use the primary token to get the secondary tokens for all the applications that this user is supposed to have access to. And once I have it, I pass those secondary tokens to each of the apps, and each of the apps can now use them to make calls to their own systems. One of the challenges, or one of the things which we haven't solved, to be fair, in this picture is that we haven't completely identified how would be the communication in between for the steps 2 and 8. So if you think about from a protocol perspective, we know the AS and IDP talks via SAML. We know that the token agent and the AS talks OAuth. We haven't completely nailed down of the flow which will happen between the token agent and the mobile application. There are some other issues which may come up if you have multiple resource servers, and each of these resource servers have their own OAuth AS. So when I give the 9 to the resource server has to validate that token. So it can either validate that by itself, or it can make an API call to the OAuth AS to validate it. So there are a few other, I guess, flows in terms of the complete end-to-end picture that we need to implement to make sure we kind of take care of the 3 deployment models that I mentioned earlier. But other than that, I think a couple of the vendors, we have implemented that. We've been working on an interop. We demoed some of that at last year's CIS. We have a session this afternoon to kind of do a deep dive on the 2 or 3 edge cases that I mentioned. Other than that, there is good implementation and good support from the vendors I mentioned earlier. So hopefully that in the next 6 months or so, my expectation is that you will start to see some products which implement. And I think Brian mentioned this morning that standards take a long time to come to fruition, and this is no different. I think we've been talking over an year, if not more. Having said that, the support and the other people who kind of came in to help develop this spec has been is very great. So I'm happy to kind of report that we finally, I know within VMware we have an implementation. I know Ping has an implementation, and hopefully in the next few months you get to see some more interoperability and see this in action. Okay. I think this is all the content I had. Okay, go ahead. I'm going to start. It's easier to go back. Go ahead.
So, for the step 2A, do you see a necessity of having the OS vendors as a part of this growth to develop a better way of interacting between the app to app?
So,
or rather, let me put it that way. Is there any effort to include them into the growth?
So we have had discussions with Google. We have had discussions with Samsung. We couldn't find anybody at Apple to talk to, which isn't new. I think from a Samsung perspective, like I mentioned, they actually have an SSO layer which is built into the NOPPS platform. So they are definitely into it. When we talk to Google, Google actually have what they call the Google Account Manager, and they have something on top of that they call the Google Auth utility. So they actually do 2 and 8, and they actually do much of this because they also have an API for app developers to embed. The challenge with the Google is that, at least when we talk to them, their focus has primarily been on the developer ecosystem as compared to the enterprise. So for all of this presentation, I kind of focused on the enterprise use cases, just because I think majority of the audience and just where the work is focused, not to kind of ignore the consumer mobile application development system. So when you talk to Google, their thought process is that we want to piggyback all of this on top of Google ID. So they actually have OAuth AS running in the cloud. Any Android developer who writes the application, they can get the OAuth access token. And this idea of token agent to receive a token on behalf of something else, they actually support that within the Android platform. Our challenge comes in, first of all, it's only for Android. We want to be able to have a consistent interface across the operating system. And who knows, Microsoft may actually have an operating system. So we want to make sure that, well, as of now, their market share is about 2.3%. It rose from 2.3 to 5.7, so they are making some progress. So from our perspective, from a spec development perspective, we want to make sure this kind of goes across. And second, we have to find a way to connect to Enterprise AD. We just cannot piggyback just on top of the Google system. Plus, the enterprise IT admins need a way to policy and manage and expire tokens and revoke tokens and all that. So given all that, I think we need to build it. Having said that, if Apple and Google kind of agree to participate in the spec, and Google has been fairly heavily involved, by the way, we don't really have a reason to make it. We think it's easier to convince an app developer if that layer comes from the operating system as compared to we building it and giving it to them. Go ahead.
Hey Ashish, I'm Tani from Likewise Consulting. My question is, the OAuth token that you use here for SSO between native applications, can we use the same OAuth token for hybrid as well as web-based mobile applications? Can we use that? Should that be in the same sandbox that you are using?
So actually it's a good question, and I didn't walk you through the flow. So there is 2 types of flow. So our focus is mainly access to application from a mobile device. And even though I pictured only a native mobile app because this is how we started it, there is actually 2 types of app. There's an app type in the spec. In the latest latest draft of the spec, we actually have 2 app types. And we want to include the web types also, because at the end of the day, if I open up a browser or if I have a web clip, which is for WebEx, I go through the exact same thing and exact same pane. So we want to make sure that kind of gets addressed too. So in that case, what we have done is, it's slightly different than here. And the actual flow, I don't have it over here, is the web application, the very first time it interacts, it gets like a one-time token. And then the web application then uses that one-time token to convert that into an OAuth access token or a SAML token that it needs. So the way we operate, And it kind of works fairly great if you can talk to the browser vendors on the device. In our case, we do have a browser on a mobile device, so it's just easier for us. But the thought process is that you use a browser, talk to a token agent, and then get a token, give it to the target web application with a SAML endpoint, and then we generate SAML on the fly. So there is a ways to do that. And in the IDP init model, where you essentially see a bunch of icons, whether they're a web clip or a native app, the flow that we are able to get the token for a web app and convert that to a SAML works fairly well too. So we laid it out how the spec would work for both of these flows.
And how do you take care of single sign-off? This is all single sign-off. Say I want to log off from one app or the other app, how about it?
So the single logout by general will take a very, very long time to talk, because honestly, I'm not going to speak in terms of the SAML community. Even talking about the SAML for single logout, the most easy way to implement that is to close the browser, because there is always so many options and the deployment models in terms of, when I go in, I click on it, what does that mean? And it works okay when you are within the enterprise, so it's kind of acceptable to be able to close the session for all the application. It gets harder for single logout when some of the applications are completely independent. Like for instance, if I happen to have Box and Dropbox, you wouldn't want to click logout on Box, which also locks you out from Dropbox, right? That just wouldn't fly. So single logout in generally is a harder thing to do. In the IDP init flow, the benefit of this is this. As an IT admin, I can control the invalidation of all the tokens because I have one place to go to, that's token agent that I manage. As an end user, if I come to the launch portal, which is I do the come to a single place and see all the applications, I can click logout on that. Now, that's not to say there will not be active session on the target applications. I mean, even in the browser world today, I can click logout on my IDP, but if I have an active session running at Salesforce, that can still be running, because that depends if the Salesforce and WebEx and Box have implemented those APIs and how good they are and so forth. Right? So given all that, logout is a bigger issue. In the IDP launching scenario, you can log out from your launcher and you will not have access. However, if the target native app is maintaining a session, it's maintaining a session.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
How does the token agent handle multiple personas within a single device?
How does the token agent handle multiple personas? So I'm not sure if we have addressed that use case. I think the easiest I was going to say is that you have a notion of logging out and logging in. And generally we think these devices are more personal than they have been, unless you are going into the work personal persona concept.
Well, work personal, or I have a contractor that works, let's say it's for VMware, that works for me and has multiple identities. Same app. There's a lot of challenges there once you start talking about single sign-on for a device that you operate really with three different multiple identities.
Yeah, or I would call it even multi-affiliation. I was going to ask the exact same question. So if I have Box, but I'm doing Box with these three different companies I'm contracting with, when I open it, how does it know, hey, are there 3 token agents, or is there a selection process?
So I think there are 2 different cases then. One case is I'm a contractor, I use Box, and I use Box for GE, I use Box for Cisco, and I use Box for VMware. In that case, how do I log in into Box? That's kind of, I'm the same person, but I want to log into Box as a GE contractor, as a Cisco contractor, and a VMware contractor. I think that's one use case. I thought the second use case that you talk about is I have a device which I'm in a BPO company, I come in, I log in, and I have a new person who comes in, log in every day. Which is, I work for the same company, but different person use the same device.
I think it's more the former the problems today.
Okay, so I think,
Is our industry doing enough to influence Apple, which is very difficult to understand, and Google, and to some extent Microsoft for their market share, to build this containerization or some way to solve its problems? Because MDM can't solve it, because if you're a big enterprise and you have to be partnering, so it's not just a contract situation, but also partnering, you're not going to allow that other company to have MDM control of your device.
Yeah.
There has to be some way to containerize and give SSO
So I think, so I don't have a quick answer, but I think there are two ways. You know, if you take this one out, I've seen two ways the box of the world kind of handles it, right? One way they handle it is that you log in because they can assume you are you, so you have a single identity which across every tenant of box. You log in and then you see a G tab and you see a Cisco tab and you see a VMware tab. That's kind of the way, one way they solve it. The other way it gets solved is, I'm going to assume you're a completely independent person. And if you're a completely independent person, you will have different credentials. So when you go to GE, you go to the discovery page and you're going to enter an address which will redirect you to a GE endpoint. You authenticate with GE, you get back a GE token. Once you are done and you want to become a Cisco contractor, you log out, you enter in the discovery process the Cisco IDP endpoint, and you go through that flow. So even if you take that away from the picture, the way I believe there are only two ways how I have seen being solved, which is you are one person and across the whole thing you have single credentials and you have a single IDP. In that case, the IDP becomes the SaaS provider IDP because GE will not allow you to use Cisco as an IDP even if you are the same person. So I think that problem exists even without it, and I need to think a little bit more of how can we help or address or at least propose to kind of move the ball forward than what we have. Go ahead. Yes?
So one of the issues you talked about at the beginning, you talked about, of course, you know, the pain threshold with single signing on across native apps, but you also talked about the long-lived access tokens being handed out by SaaS providers that persisted in their lifetime beyond, you know, account deletion or deprovisioning. It doesn't seem like this would really help it because this shows a single AS. But in the case where the token agent is obtaining a token from a separate AS, say Salesforce, as I understand the spec, you're going to use your primary token to get an ID token and use a JAWT assertion flow to the Salesforce AS, which would return a Salesforce token. So it seems the Salesforce token would still be out of control from the spec and it can still provision the mobile app with the
So I think the way it will happen, the way it can potentially help would be that the token agent in many ways contains the secondary token for all the applications. So even though the SaaS providers haven't, you know, you depend on SaaS providers today to disable the account or invalidate the token. The connection in between the IDP and AD has been fairly decent of all the IDPs I have seen. So the way it normally works, at least in many of the implementations I have seen, is when the user gets deprovisioned from AD, the IDP normally detects it. And when the IDP detects it, then it can actually make sure that the secondary tokens for that users are invalidated. So when the mobile app comes to the token agent to get back a secondary token, it's going to be invalidated, and it will not get a new token unless you authenticate the user again, which will block because the IDP will say you're not a valid user. Now, this still depends of how often does the mobile application request for 2 and 8. If the mobile application says this is a flip which happens every time, and I'm going to try to keep it for 30 days before I go back to a token agent, then if you're not going to check, then you're not going to get it. But we at least give a way that there would be an up-to-date valid tokens which the IT admin has a single place to manage. So instead of relying on every SaaS provider like WebEx and Box and Salesforce, that they take care of deprovisioning, they take care of invalidating the tokens, you are now relying as an IT admin on the IDP to make sure that all the tokens handing it out are valid and up to date. So it doesn't completely help if the app developer doesn't check for next 30 days, but at least there is a much easier way, and the SDK you would expect should be able to configure how often should you go to token agent to ask for a 2. Go ahead. So I think that was my point earlier, which I said there are a few areas which we haven't completely nailed down, which is the how do we communicate in between 2 and 8, because it also depends at the OS level. Because we need to validate before the token agent can issue a token on behalf of this, he needs to make sure that the person who is calling me is actually a mobile application, right? So to indicate who the app is, we use custom URL, we use bundle ID to verify it, where the other detail I mentioned about the app info. So the idea behind this is before any of this happens, the mobile application has to register itself and its bundle ID and its custom URL to the AS so that we know who to hand out the token to and we know who to expect who's requesting a token. Having said that, the chances are many of the MDM vendors or many of the mobile application management vendor may have their own proprietary ways to communicate. So from a spec perspective, we're going to list 1 or 2 ways how you can communicate. But if somebody has a better IPC mechanism for multiple native apps to talk, they should be still able to leverage that. Okay, I know I'm running out of time, so go ahead.
Do you see the token agent being an independent entity or it just meshes into the NAPPS?
So from the spec perspective and from the interoperability perspective, the goal is that you can have an SDK from any vendor, you can have a token agent from any vendor, and you can have the OAuth AS from any vendor and IDP from any vendor. So when we list out the interoperability scenarios, our thought process is that, just an example of what we laid out, the AirWatch or Mobile Iron, which are the MDM vendor, can act as the token agent, Ping can act as the OAuth AS, and VMware can act as the SAML IDP, or Okta can act as the SAML IDP. We want to make sure that flow is tested, verified, interoperable, and so forth. Now, from a packaging and a distribution perspective, if the identity vendors like Ping wants to merge the token agent with their IDP launcher or their desktop agent, that's totally fine. From an AirWatch perspective or a Mobile Iron MDM perspective, if they also want to ship OAuth AS with their product, that's totally fine. But from a spec perspective, these are well-defined independent components. Okay, go ahead.
Is there a possibility of having multiple token agents on the same device?
Having the multiple token agent, so this is in the list of cases where we hide into a fine print into the spec, but we talked about the idea of a multiple agent because the first thing that you have to do is from an application, you have to discover which agent to go to. And I think this kind of goes back to your question, because if I'm a contractor with GE and with Cisco, and GE uses a different token agent, a different vendor, and Cisco uses a different vendor. So the first process in any of this is the discovery process, and the most common way of discovery today is you enter an email address, and you enter the email address, it goes back to your enterprise domain, he figures out the endpoint, and he figures out the custom URL, the bundle ID of the token agent, it tells that to the app, and then app now knows which token agent to go to. So in theory, yes, you are able to have multiple token agents, and at runtime, by entering the email address, the native app and the SDK can figure out which token agent to discover and go to. Would it create any issues in terms of persistence? We just haven't seen them yet. Okay, I'm going to take one last question because you've been asking, and then we can close it.
This will work. Did you guys think about the attribute exchange and then different types of authentications? One app, I probably want a universal password. Next step, I need a higher security password or some kind of a different credentials. And also, the applications, if it's a simple yes or no answer, this works. But sometimes the application needs a delay and attribute something at the right? So, did you guys think about attribute exchange?
So, fair enough. So I think you have two questions. One of them is the attribute part, which is I want richer than just the ID token and information. The second question I thought you were asking was that, I can't see from here, but I know I'm late. The second question was that if I have multiple types of mobile application, one application is good enough to say I need username and a password, other applications say I need a smart card or I need, fingerprint, device fingerprinting, right? So how would we address that, right? So far, if you think about it, when the token agent goes to the AS and he says, I need a secondary token for mobile app A and I need a secondary token for mobile app B. At that point of time, in between the AS and the IDP, there should be a policy which should say that this is the type of token. Before I can issue the token, I need to make sure he has been authenticated. So in the earlier talk today, in the ID token format, I think Brian mentioned the ARF reference, which is authentication context. Okay, something. I still call it authent context. But the authent context reference, so what is possible to happen is that when you configure and register the application with your OAuth AS, you should be able to tell what kind of auth and context that you need. And then at runtime, when the token agent goes to the authorization server to get a secondary token, you can enforce it. So you can say that you haven't done the authentication for this type of event. So it's completely possible that I access mobile app A, which requires AD and password. I do the SSO. I require mobile app 2, which also requires AD and password. That works. But mobile app 3 needs smart card. And at that point of time, I'm going to challenge you again for different type of. So the spec allows it. The implementation then goes back to the vendor who decides to implement it, because there is some implication in terms of policy management and enforcement when you do that. Okay, I think we are out of time, so thanks again for your time. And I think we have a workshop or a deep dive into this later today. So if you guys are still interested to have a better look, you're welcome to join. Okay, thank you.